The story of the Tupolev Tu-2 begins in one of the most paradoxical and dramatic settings in aviation history: the prisons of Stalin's Soviet Union. In the late 1930s, as the USSR accelerated its modernization of the Red Air Force, Soviet authorities arrested many leading engineers and designers during the Great Purge. Among them was Andrei Tupolev, one of the most accomplished figures in Soviet aeronautics. Despite his imprisonment in 1937 on charges of sabotage and anti-Soviet activity, Tupolev continued his work within the confines of a Sharashka, a secret prison labor design bureau. It was here that the foundations of the Tu-2 were laid. By 1939, the Soviet Union faced a pressing need for a modern medium bomber. The rapid advances in military aviation abroad, particularly in Germany and Britain, had produced high-speed bombers and versatile twin-engine designs. The Soviet Air Force, however, relied heavily on aging types like the SB and the DB-3, which were increasingly inadequate in speed, payload, and survivability. The authorities tasked Tupolev's imprisoned design team with creating a new aircraft that could meet these demands. The concept envisioned was bold: a twin-engine bomber with the speed of a fighter, the ability to carry a substantial bomb load, and the versatility to perform dive bombing as well as level bombing. The Design Bureau, officially designated TSKB-29, brought together many of the USSR's finest minds in aeronautics, albeit working under duress. Engineers, pilots, and technicians collaborated within prison walls, producing preliminary sketches and mock-ups despite shortages of resources and constant political oversight. The initial design, known as the ANT-58 and later ANT-60, set the stage for what would become the Tu-2. Tupolev's team emphasized aerodynamic efficiency, robust construction, and the use of powerful inline engines. The aircraft was intended to carry up to 3,000 kilograms of bombs internally, a significant increase over existing Soviet bombers, while achieving speeds of over 500 kilometers per hour. Its fuselage was streamlined, and its defensive armament was designed to offer protection against enemy fighters without excessive drag. Despite the challenges of working in confinement, the project advanced rapidly by Soviet standards. The urgency of impending conflict. By 1939, the Soviet Union was already involved in the Winter War against Finland, and observing the rise of German air power pushed the authorities to prioritize the bomber's development. Tupolev himself played a direct role in solving engineering challenges even while under guard, and his team benefited from access to captured foreign technology and intelligence on aircraft like the German Junkers Ju-88. By 1940, the prototype was ready for assembly. Under extraordinary conditions, engineers transferred from prison workshops to state factories to bring the design into tangible form. What emerged was not only a response to Soviet strategic needs, but also a testimony to the resilience of imprisoned scientists and designers working under repression. The aircraft would soon prove to be one of the most capable and versatile bombers of the Second World War, combining speed, payload, and adaptability in ways that reshaped Soviet air power. The origins of the Tu-2 thus combine political tragedy with technical triumph. Conceived in a prison labor design bureau driven by the urgent need for modern bombers and shaped by the vision of Tupolev, the Tu-2 embodied the contradictions of Soviet wartime innovation. Born of repression, yet destined to play a decisive role in the struggle for survival against Nazi Germany. It was here, in the closed walls of the Sharashka, that the foundations of the Soviet Union's masterpiece medium bomber were set. The prototype phase of the Tu-2's development unfolded in the early years of the Second World War, a period when Soviet industry was under immense pressure to produce modern aircraft quickly, while simultaneously relocating factories eastward in anticipation of German invasion. Despite these challenges, Tupolev's team pushed forward with the ANT-58 prototype, completing its construction in 1940. The first flight took place later that year, and the results immediately showed promise. The aircraft demonstrated high speed for its class, reaching over 500 kilometers per hour in level flight. This placed it in the same performance range as contemporary twin-engine bombers like the German Ju-88 and the British de Havilland Mosquito, but with the advantage of carrying a larger bomb load internally. The Tu-2 also exhibited stability during dive bombing trials, fulfilling one of its design objectives to act as a versatile attack aircraft capable of precision strikes. Yet the early prototypes faced difficulties. The first models were powered by liquid-cooled Maquilin AM-37 engines, which offered strong performance but suffered from reliability issues. Overheating and mechanical failures were frequent, and Soviet production of these engines struggled to keep pace with demand. Furthermore, the complexity of the design posed problems for mass production. Streamlined fuselage sections and advanced wing structures required precise manufacturing tolerances that Soviet factories, already under strain, sometimes found difficult to achieve. Flight testing throughout 1940 and 1941 revealed both strengths and weaknesses. Pilots praised the aircraft's handling characteristics, noting that it flew more like a heavy fighter than a traditional bomber. The bomb bay design allowed for a flexible payload arrangement, from general-purpose bombs to specialized ordnance. Defensive armament consisting of multiple 7.62 mm and later 12.7 mm machine guns was considered sufficient for the time, though improvements would soon be required as enemy fighters grew more powerful. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 altered the entire context of the Tu-2's development. With Operation Barbarossa rapidly destroying much of the Soviet Air Force's outdated bomber fleet, the need for modern aircraft became critical. Production plans for the Tu-2 were accelerated, but shortages of AM-37 engines forced a redesign. Tupolev's team adapted the aircraft to use the more reliable Shvetsov AS-82 air-cooled radial engines, which not only improved availability but also enhanced battlefield survivability by reducing vulnerability to coolant system damage. This change required significant modifications to the fuselage and engine mounts, but ultimately gave the Tu-2 greater long-term viability. By late 1941 and into 1942, several prototypes and pre-production aircraft underwent combat evaluation. Test pilots reported that the Tu-2 combined speed, maneuverability, and bomb load in a way unmatched by other Soviet designs. Unlike the slower PE-2 dive bomber, the Tu-2 could carry heavier payloads while maintaining performance sufficient to evade or engage enemy fighters. Its low-level bombing accuracy and ability to operate in poor weather further increased its attractiveness to commanders seeking versatile strike options. The decision to commit to full production was made in 1942, though delays persisted due to the relocation of aviation factories to the Urals and Siberia. By this time, however, the aircraft had already proven its worth in trials, demonstrating that it could deliver heavy payloads against both strategic and tactical targets. Soviet engineers continued refining the design during this phase, strengthening the airframe, upgrading the defensive armament, and simplifying some production elements to meet wartime demands. The prototype and testing era of the Tu-2 therefore marked the transition from concept to reality. It was a period defined by technical adjustments, engine substitutions, and the constant balancing of performance with producibility. Despite the upheaval of war and the limitations of Soviet industry, Tupolev's bomber survived its trial by fire, ready to enter mass production and join the fight on the Eastern Front. The Tu-2 officially entered service with the Soviet Air Force in 1942, though in limited numbers at first. Its integration into operational units was shaped by the urgent demands of the Eastern Front, where the Red Army desperately needed an aircraft that could strike deep behind enemy lines while also providing flexible support to ground operations. Initial squadrons were formed in late 1942, composed of experienced crews selected to evaluate the bomber under real combat conditions. The first combat deployments revealed both the strengths and the challenges of introducing a new aircraft during wartime. Crews immediately noted the Tu-2's speed advantage over other Soviet bombers. Whereas the PE-2 dive bomber reached maximum speeds of around 540 km per hour with a smaller payload, the Tu-2 could maintain similar speeds while carrying up to 3,000 kilograms of bombs internally. This allowed missions against German supply hubs, airfields, and troop concentrations to be conducted with reduced exposure to interception. Reactions from pilots and commanders were largely positive. Pilots described the Tu-2 as highly responsive, capable of evasive maneuvers unusual for a bomber of its size. Its cockpit layout provided good visibility, and the arrangement of defensive gun positions gave crews confidence in their ability to repel enemy fighters. However, the aircraft was not invulnerable. Luftwaffe units equipped with Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s posed a constant threat, and losses during the first missions underscored the importance of escort fighters. The Tu-2's first operational use occurred in the late stages of the Battle of Rozhev in early 1943, when small numbers of bombers were used to strike German positions and logistical centers. Although not yet deployed in mass, their presence marked the beginning of the type's contribution to Soviet offensive operations. Reports from these early sorties emphasized the bomber's effectiveness in precision low and medium altitude attacks, as well as its ability to withstand damage and return to base even after sustaining hits. As production increased in 1943, more units received the aircraft, though distribution was uneven due to ongoing bottlenecks in engine and parts supply. Commanders soon began to experiment with tactical uses beyond standard bombing runs. Tu-2s were tasked with dive-bombing hardened positions, a role in which their stability and bomb-aiming equipment proved valuable. Others were used for interdiction missions against rail lines and bridges, targeting the logistical lifelines that sustained German forces on the Eastern Front. By mid-1943, the Tu-2 began to appear in larger numbers during key operations, including the massive Battle of Kursk. Although still far fewer in number than the ubiquitous Pe-2, Tu-2 units participated in strikes against German armored reserves and artillery positions. The aircraft's heavier bomb load meant it could deliver decisive blows to concentrated targets, complementing the smaller and more numerous Pe-2 formations. Soviet commanders came to view the Tu-2 as a frontline heavy bomber, filling a critical gap between tactical strike aircraft and the long-range Il-4 bombers. The introduction of the Tu-2 was not without obstacles. Maintenance crews faced difficulties with spare parts availability, especially in the early period when production lines were still being established in evacuated factories. Furthermore, training new crews to handle the bomber's advanced systems required additional time, at a moment when the Red Air Force needed every available aircraft in combat. Nevertheless, the aircraft quickly earned a reputation for reliability once properly maintained, solidifying its place in Soviet air strategy. By the end of 1943, the Tu-2 had moved beyond its trial phase into active combat service across multiple sectors of the Eastern Front. It had proven itself capable of operating in diverse roles: tactical bombing, precision strikes, interdiction, and even limited close support. Soviet air commanders, impressed with its versatility, began advocating for increased production. The Tu-2 was no longer an experimental bomber tested under limited conditions. It had become a trusted weapon of the Red Air Force, ready to expand its role in the decisive campaigns that lay ahead. The Tu-2's wider combat deployment in 1944 marked the transition from promising newcomer to a mainstay of Soviet frontline aviation. By this stage of the war, the Red Army was steadily advancing westward, and the need for powerful medium bombers to break German defensive positions, disrupt supply lines, and support large-scale offensives had grown substantially. The Tu-2, with its balance of speed, payload, and versatility, became an indispensable tool in these operations. One of the first major offensives where the Tu-2 played a significant role was Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944. During this massive Soviet push into Belarus, Tu-2s were deployed against key logistical nodes, railway junctions, bridges, and supply depots. Flying in formations, they were able to deliver concentrated bomb loads of up to 3 tons per sortie, crippling German mobility and complicating efforts to bring reserves to the front. In several instances, Tu-2 groups struck at German airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground and reducing the Luftwaffe's ability to contest air superiority. The aircraft's speed often allowed it to evade interception. Compared to the slower Il-4 long-range bomber, the Tu-2 could penetrate deeper into enemy-controlled territory with reduced escort requirements. However, encounters with German fighters remained a constant danger. Luftwaffe FW-190s and Bf-109Gs frequently intercepted Soviet bomber groups, leading to fierce aerial battles. Despite losses, Soviet pilots reported that the Tu-2's defensive gun positions and maneuverability gave them a greater chance of survival than crews flying older designs. As operations moved west into Poland and the Baltic states, Tu-2s expanded their mission set. Beyond interdiction, they were increasingly used in direct battlefield support. At the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945, Tu-2s targeted entrenched German strongholds, artillery emplacements, and troop concentrations ahead of advancing Soviet ground forces. The ability to deliver heavy bombs with accuracy, especially when dive bombing, made them particularly effective against fortified positions. This role distinguished them from the more numerous PE-2s, which excelled in smaller precision strikes but lacked the same payload capacity. Tactical adaptation was a hallmark of the Tu-2 service. Crews experimented with low-level bombing runs to surprise German defenders, though these missions exposed the aircraft to heavy anti-aircraft fire. In some cases, Tu-2s were fitted with external rockets or used in mixed formations with Il-2 Sturmovix, combining precision bombing with close air support firepower. Soviet commanders valued this flexibility, recognizing that the Tu-2 could bridge the gap between strategic and tactical bombing in ways few other aircraft could. The bomber's contribution was not without setbacks. Harsh winter conditions in 1944 and 1945 complicated operations with snow-covered airfields and limited visibility challenging crews. Engine performance sometimes suffered in extreme cold, and maintenance remained a constant concern in forward-deployed bases. Nevertheless, the aircraft's robust construction and reliability under combat stress earned it a strong reputation among crews. Many pilots noted that the Tu-2 could absorb significant battle damage and still return to base, an essential quality in the attritional air campaigns of the Eastern Front. By 1945, Tu-2 units were striking targets deep in Germany itself. During the East Prussian and Berlin offensives, the bomber took part in large-scale raids that destroyed rail hubs, ammunition depots, and defensive positions, hastening the collapse of German resistance. In several documented operations, Tu-2s bombed strategic crossings over the Oder River, impeding German retreats and reinforcing Soviet ground advances. Their presence in the final battles for Berlin underscored the aircraft's status as one of the Red Air Force's most effective weapons by the war's end. Throughout this period, the Tu-2's reputation continued to grow. Soviet commanders and pilots alike praised its balance of speed, payload, and survivability, often contrasting it with earlier bombers that had struggled to remain effective in the face of German defenses. By the conclusion of the Second World War in May 1945, the Tu-2 had established itself not only as a successful combat platform, but also as a symbol of Soviet industrial and engineering resilience, having moved from prison-born prototype to frontline weapon of victory. The years following 1945 saw the Tu-2 enter a new phase of its career, defined by adaptation, modifications, and technological evolution. While the aircraft had proven itself during the final years of the Second World War, the rapid pace of post-war aviation development required continuous improvements to keep it relevant in an environment increasingly dominated by jet propulsion. The Tu-2's robust design and adaptability ensured that it remained in service for more than a decade, both in the Soviet Union and abroad. One of the first major post-war modifications involved refining its engines. Wartime versions had primarily used the Shvetsov AS-82FN radial, a powerful and reliable engine, but engineers experimented with alternative power plants to improve performance. Some variants tested the Mikulin AM-39 inline engine, while others incorporated improvements to the AS-82 series. These upgrades offered better speed and higher service ceilings, although the core performance of the Tu-2 remained largely consistent with late-war models. Variants proliferated in the late 1940s, reflecting the Soviet emphasis on versatility. The Tu-2S became the standard production model, optimized for medium bombing missions, while the Tu-2R was configured for reconnaissance, fitted with cameras, and extended fuel tanks for long-range missions. Specialized versions, such as the Tu-2 ground attack model, experimented with heavy cannon armament and external ordnance to act as a direct battlefield support aircraft, though this role was increasingly taken over by the Il-10 and later jet-powered attackers. Another notable adaptation was the Tu-2U trainer version, equipped with dual controls. This was essential for preparing new crews during the late 1940s, as the Tu-2 was still widely used in Soviet bomber regiments. The availability of a dedicated training variant improved safety and efficiency in transitioning pilots from single-engine fighters to multi-engine bombers. Perhaps the most ambitious development was the Tu-2T torpedo bomber, designed for naval aviation. This version could carry torpedoes under its fuselage for anti-ship missions, extending the aircraft's utility to maritime warfare. However, the increasing availability of specialized long-range bombers and the rise of jet-powered naval aircraft meant that the Tu-2T was produced only in limited numbers. Beyond Soviet service, the Tu-2 became an important export. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, large numbers were supplied to China, forming the backbone of the People's Liberation Army Air Force's bomber units. Chinese Tu-2s participated in operations during the Chinese Civil War and later served during the Korean War, where they were used in conventional bombing missions. North Korea also received Tu-2s, employing them in the early months of the Korean conflict before they were largely withdrawn due to vulnerability against jet fighters such as the American F-86 Sabre. The aircraft also entered service in Eastern European air forces, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. In these nations, the Tu-2 served as both a combat bomber and a training platform, providing valuable experience to crews transitioning into more modern designs. In several cases, the Tu-2 was the first modern twin-engine bomber available to Warsaw Pact states, serving as a bridge between wartime technology and the new jet age. Throughout its post-war career, the Tu-2 was gradually overshadowed by newer designs, most notably the jet-powered Tu-14 and the Ilyushin Il-28, which entered service in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Nevertheless, the Tu-2 remained in frontline use in the Soviet Union into the mid-1950s and in foreign air forces even longer. Its adaptability, ease of maintenance, and ruggedness ensured its survival as a second-line aircraft even as aviation moved rapidly into a new era. The evolution of the Tu-2 illustrates the broader trajectory of Soviet aviation in the post-war years. While the bomber was conceived under the extraordinary conditions of Stalin's Sharashkas and matured during the brutal test of the Eastern Front, its post-war career demonstrated its ability to adapt to changing strategic environments. From reconnaissance and training to naval and foreign service, the Tu-2 proved to be more than a wartime improvisation. It was a platform of enduring relevance, capable of bridging the gap between piston-powered bombers of the 1940s and the jet-powered fleets of the Cold War. The global impact and legacy of the Tu-2 extended far beyond its wartime service, shaping both Soviet air doctrine and the development of Allied air forces during the early Cold War. Although conceived in a prison and rushed into combat during a time of national crisis, the Tu-2 evolved into a symbol of Soviet resilience and technical ingenuity. Its influence was felt across multiple domains, in combat experience, in export policy, and in the long-term trajectory of medium bomber design. Within the Soviet Union, the Tu-2 became a transitional cornerstone. It was the last piston-engine medium bomber to serve as a backbone of the Red Air Force before jet technology took over. For nearly a decade after 1945, Tu-2 regiments formed a critical component of Soviet bomber aviation, used not only for conventional bombing but also for reconnaissance, maritime operations, and training missions. Its versatility provided commanders with a reliable platform as the USSR reorganized its air forces around new strategic requirements in the early Cold War. By the time it was phased out of frontline use in the mid-1950s, the Tu-2 had given an entire generation of crews their first experience with high-performance multi-engine bombers. Internationally, the Tu-2's export story underlined the Soviet Union's growing role as a military supplier to Allied states. The bomber was transferred in considerable numbers to China beginning in 1950, where it became one of the first modern combat aircraft of the newly established People's Liberation Army Air Force. Chinese Tu-2s participated in bombing campaigns during the late stages of the Chinese Civil War and continued to see operational use during the Korean War. Their vulnerability to American jet fighters highlighted the rapid obsolescence of piston bombers in the jet age, but their presence gave China a valuable starting point in developing its own air capabilities. Other nations in the Warsaw Pact also benefited from the Tu-2. Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary all received the aircraft, which was integrated into their air forces primarily for training and second-line roles. While these aircraft rarely saw combat, they played an essential part in standardizing Soviet bloc aviation, ensuring that Allied pilots gained experience with advanced twin-engine bombers before transitioning to jet-powered Il-28s and later models. In this way, the Tu-2 functioned not only as a weapon of war, but also as a tool of Soviet military diplomacy and bloc cohesion. The legacy of the Tu-2 also rests on its technical and doctrinal influence. As one of the fastest and most heavily armed piston-engine bombers of its generation, it demonstrated the effectiveness of combining high speed with significant payload. This principle carried into later Soviet jet bombers, where designers emphasized speed and survivability over sheer bomb load. The Tu-2's ability to dive bomb, conduct low-level precision strikes, and deliver heavy payloads influenced Soviet thinking on multi-purpose bomber design well into the jet age. In terms of cultural memory, the Tu-2 occupies a unique place in aviation history. It was the only major combat aircraft of the Second World War designed under imprisonment, a fact that has fascinated historians and underscored the contradictions of Stalin's Soviet Union. Repression and innovation intertwined in a single machine. The bomber's success became part of the rehabilitation of Andrei Tupolev, who was released and restored to prominence as one of the USSR's most important aircraft designers, eventually leading projects that defined Soviet aviation for decades. Today, surviving Tu-2s can be found in museums across Russia, China, and Eastern Europe. Restored examples highlight its streamlined fuselage, spacious bomb bay, and defensive gun emplacements, serving as reminders of its wartime and post-war service. While overshadowed in popular memory by Western bombers like the Mosquito or B-25 Mitchell, the Tu-2 remains highly regarded among aviation historians for its performance and impact. In retrospect, the Tu-2 stands as both a technical achievement and a political symbol. It bridged the gap between wartime necessity and post-war strategy, between repression and innovation, between piston-engine bombers and the dawn of jets. Its enduring influence can be measured not just in the thousands built and the nations that flew it, but in the legacy it left on Soviet design philosophy and its role in shaping the first decade of Cold War aviation. Though the Tu-2 is most often remembered for its frontline combat service during the Second World War and its role as a workhorse bomber in the immediate post-war years, it also had a series of lesser-known chapters that reveal the depth of its utility and the adaptability of its design. These forgotten missions, experimental modifications, and specialized applications shed further light on why the aircraft remained relevant well into the 1950s. One of the more unusual applications of the Tu-2 was its use in research and testing. During the late 1940s, several Tu-2 airframes were modified to serve as testbeds for new weapon systems and aeronautical technologies. Some were fitted with prototype radar equipment, allowing engineers to explore the integration of airborne navigation and targeting aids that were still in their infancy within the Soviet Union. Others tested new bomb release mechanisms, external hardpoints, and underwing rocket systems. In this way, the Tu-2 provided a stable and proven platform for experimentation at a time when resources for designing entirely new prototypes were limited. The Tu-2 also played a role in the early Soviet exploration of nuclear weapons delivery. Although it was quickly deemed unsuitable for strategic nuclear roles due to its limited range and payload compared to emerging heavy bombers, several Tu-2s were used to test bomb handling procedures and delivery accuracy with large ordnance. These experiments informed Soviet doctrine for precision strike aircraft and provided valuable experience until purpose-built platforms, such as the Tu-4, a reverse-engineered B-29, entered service. In naval aviation, the Tu-2T torpedo bomber variant represented an ambitious attempt to adapt the aircraft for maritime strike missions. Though ultimately overshadowed by more specialized designs, this version demonstrated the flexibility of Tupolev's airframe. Soviet naval pilots conducted training and experimental exercises in the late 1940s with Tu-2Ts, practicing anti-ship tactics that would later be refined with jet-powered aircraft. Even though the Tu-2T did not achieve mass deployment, it broadened the bomber's operational footprint beyond traditional land campaigns. The aircraft also played a behind-the-scenes role in pilot training and transition programs. The Tu-2U dual-control trainer became invaluable for preparing new bomber crews during the late 1940s and early 1950s. Many young aviators who would go on to fly the Il-28 or other Cold War-era aircraft first gained experience in the Tu-2. This continuity gave the bomber an educational importance that extended far beyond its direct combat role. Beyond the Soviet Union, the Tu-2's story includes overlooked combat chapters in Asia. In China, Tu-2s were used not only during the late stages of the Civil War, but also in operations over Tibet in the early 1950s, where they flew missions against resistance groups. These deployments were rarely publicized, but demonstrated the bomber's continued utility in roles far removed from the vast mechanized battles of the Eastern Front. Similarly, in the Korean War, Tu-2s operated by the North Korean Air Force saw limited but notable action in the early months of the conflict, particularly in night raids against UN positions. Although highly vulnerable to jet interceptors, they nevertheless contributed to the diverse array of aircraft employed in the skies over Korea. There were also planned projects that never reached fruition. Soviet engineers sketched concepts for a long-range Tu-2 derivative with extended wings and greater fuel capacity, though it was quickly abandoned once jet propulsion became dominant. Another project proposed using Tu-2 airframes as drone controllers, carrying radio equipment to guide unmanned aircraft during experimental trials. These ideas illustrate how designers sought to extract every possible application from a proven wartime design before moving fully into the jet age. Finally, the memories of those who flew and maintained the Tu-2 form an essential part of its lesser-known legacy. Veterans consistently described it as a pilot's bomber, emphasizing its maneuverability and resilience. Crews recalled missions where Tu-2s returned to base with heavy damage that would have downed other aircraft. Mechanics praised the accessibility of its systems compared to other Soviet bombers, noting that despite its advanced design, it was relatively straightforward to repair in field conditions. These unseen chapters, ranging from nuclear trials and naval experiments to forgotten combat missions in Asia, demonstrate the depth of the Tu-2's contribution to Soviet and Allied aviation. More than a frontline bomber, it was a versatile platform that bridged multiple roles, trained generations of aviators, and served as a testbed for technologies that shaped the Cold War era. Its hidden history reinforces its reputation as not only a masterpiece of wartime design, but also a foundation stone of Soviet post-war aviation development. The final legacy of the Tu-2 lies not only in its combat record or post-war service, but in its enduring place in aviation history as a symbol of Soviet ingenuity under duress, and its role in shaping the transition from wartime piston-powered aircraft to the jet age. By the time the last Tu-2s were withdrawn from active service in the Soviet Union in the mid-1950s, the aircraft had already left a deep imprint on military aviation, both in doctrine and in memory. One of the most significant aspects of the Tu-2's legacy is its demonstration of what a medium bomber could achieve when designed for speed, flexibility, and survivability. Unlike many contemporaries which were optimized for either high-altitude bombing or tactical strike, the Tu-2 combined multiple roles. It could deliver heavy payloads on strategic targets, dive bomb entrenched positions, or conduct interdiction raids against logistical networks. This versatility influenced subsequent Soviet bomber designs, reinforcing the idea that aircraft needed to operate across a spectrum of missions rather than being limited to a single role. Equally important was the political and symbolic meaning of the Tu-2. Born in the confines of Stalin's Sharashka system, the aircraft became a testament to the paradoxes of Soviet society: repression on one side, innovation on the other. Andrei Tupolev's rehabilitation after the war was closely tied to the success of the Tu-2, which restored his reputation and positioned him to lead the design of major post-war aircraft, including the Tu-4, Tu-16, and Tu-95. In this way, the Tu-2 was more than just a bomber. It was the foundation of a design lineage that would define Soviet strategic aviation for decades. The bomber also left an international legacy. In China, it served as the first modern medium bomber of the People's Liberation Army Air Force, shaping Chinese doctrine and giving crews their first experience with twin-engine bombers. Its use in the Korean War, though brief and costly, placed it among the aircraft that contested the skies in the first conflict of the jet era. In Eastern Europe, it trained generations of Warsaw Pact aviators, providing a bridge between wartime piston types and the Cold War jet fleet. In terms of production scale, more than 2,500 Tu-2s were built, a remarkable figure given the industrial challenges of wartime and post-war Soviet Union. Their widespread service ensured that thousands of pilots, navigators, gunners, and mechanics became familiar with the type. For many of them, the Tu-2 represented their first introduction to advanced bomber operations, shaping the culture and practices of Soviet bomber aviation well into the Cold War. The Tu-2's presence in museums today further underscores its historical significance. Preserved examples in Russia, China, and Europe highlight not only its technical features, but also its broader story: a bomber designed in prison, tested under the pressure of invasion, and perfected during some of the largest battles in history. For modern audiences, it serves as both a machine of war and a window into the political and industrial complexities of the Soviet Union during the mid-20th century. Culturally, the Tu-2 is remembered in the Soviet Union, and its successor states as one of the great wartime achievements of domestic aviation. It is often compared to the British Mosquito or the German Ju-88, both multi-purpose bombers of similar philosophy. In these comparisons, the Tu-2 stands out for its combination of payload, survivability, and adaptability to diverse missions. Unlike the Mosquito, it was not built from lightweight materials but from rugged, combat-ready structures capable of absorbing damage. Unlike the Ju-88, it was introduced later and in fewer numbers but with performance that matched or exceeded its adversaries. In summary, the Tu-2's ultimate legacy lies in its role as a transitional aircraft that bridged two eras, the brutal necessities of the Second World War and the emerging demands of the Cold War. It demonstrated the effectiveness of multi-purpose bomber design, rehabilitated one of the Soviet Union's most important designers, and equipped not only Soviet but also Allied air forces with a formidable tool of war. Though eventually overshadowed by jet bombers, its reputation as the Soviet Union's masterpiece piston engine bomber remains intact, securing its place as one of the most important aircraft of the mid-20th century. The Tu-2's service life gradually came to an end in the 1950s, yet its withdrawal from frontline roles did not diminish the aircraft's historical weight. Instead, the process of phasing it out reflected both the rapid technological progress of the post-war years and the enduring value the bomber had provided during a crucial transitional period in aviation. By 1950, the Soviet Union had already embraced jet technology as the future of air power. Aircraft like the Ilyushin Il-28, powered by turbojets, offered significantly higher speeds, greater altitudes, and a reduced vulnerability to modern interceptors. In this new environment, the Tu-2 was increasingly viewed as obsolete for high-intensity combat operations. Nevertheless, rather than being immediately retired, the Tu-2 was gradually shifted into secondary roles. In bomber aviation regiments, units equipped with the Tu-2 were restructured to act as training and reserve formations. Many airframes were converted into Tu-2U trainers, ensuring that new crews could practice multi-engine operations before advancing to jet-powered bombers. Exported Tu-2s remained in service even longer. China continued to operate the bomber into the mid-1950s, with some aircraft reportedly flying into the early 1960s in auxiliary roles, such as training and reconnaissance. In the Korean War, the vulnerability of Tu-2s to American jet fighters like the F-86 Sabre and F-80 Shooting Star highlighted their declining combat value. Still, they provided valuable operational experience for Chinese and North Korean crews, laying the groundwork for those air forces' development during the jet age. Eastern European nations within the Warsaw Pact also retained their Tu-2 fleets until replaced by Il-28s, often keeping them in service into the latter half of the 1950s. Domestically, the final Soviet Tu-2 units were phased out of combat service by 1955. By this time, most bomber regiments had transitioned to jet designs, and piston engine bombers were relegated to target towing, training, or specialized testing roles. Some Tu-2s were dismantled for spare parts, while others were stored in reserve depots before being scrapped. A small number were preserved as museum pieces, a recognition of their historic contribution. The withdrawal of the Tu-2 marked the end of an era. It had been the last Soviet piston-powered bomber to see large-scale service, and with its retirement, the Red Air Force entered fully into the jet age. Yet the aircraft's influence lingered. The experience gained by Soviet engineers, pilots, and commanders with the Tu-2 informed the operational doctrine of jet bombers, particularly in balancing speed, payload, and defensive armament. Its use in varied roles, from precision dive bombing to long-range interdiction, provided lessons that were applied to subsequent aircraft, including the Il-28 and the Tu-16. The transition away from the Tu-2 was also symbolic. It closed the chapter on an aircraft designed under extreme circumstances, conceived in a prison workshop during Stalin's purges, brought to life during the desperate years of the German invasion, and refined through some of the largest battles of the Second World War. Its departure from service represented not just technological progress, but also a generational shift, as the Soviet Union moved beyond the improvisations of wartime into the structured modernization of the Cold War. Though retired, the Tu-2 left behind a strong reputation among those who flew it. Veterans consistently described it as reliable, resilient, and surprisingly maneuverable for its class. Its ability to carry heavy bomb loads at high speed and survive in contested skies earned it admiration not only as a machine but also as a symbol of endurance. Even as jet bombers took over, the Tu-2 retained its place in memory as the aircraft that had carried the Red Air Force through some of its most decisive campaigns. Thus, the aftermath of the Tu-2's service did not mark an abrupt disappearance, but rather a gradual fading into history. Its retirement underscored the relentless pace of technological change, yet also affirmed the lasting importance of a bomber that had been at once a product of repression, a weapon of victory, and a foundation for the future of Soviet aviation. The long-term legacy of the Tu-2 is measured not only in the thousands of sorties it flew during the Second World War and the early Cold War, but also in its broader historical significance as a machine that embodied the contradictions of the Soviet Union. Its story combined political repression, industrial resilience, and technological achievement, leaving behind a complex memory that continues to intrigue historians and aviation enthusiasts. At the strategic level, the Tu-2 demonstrated that the Soviet Union could produce a medium bomber on par with the best contemporary designs of other powers. During the war, it rivaled the German Junkers Ju-88 and the British de Havilland Mosquito in terms of versatility, payload, and speed. For the Red Air Force, which had previously relied on less capable designs like the SB or DB-3, the Tu-2 marked a decisive leap forward. It provided Soviet commanders with a weapon that could carry out interdiction, tactical support, and precision bombing with equal effectiveness, reshaping Soviet doctrine for combined arms operations. Politically, the Tu-2 became inseparable from the rehabilitation of Andrei Tupolev. Arrested in 1937 and imprisoned in a Sharashka, he returned to prominence thanks to the success of the bomber his team produced behind bars. The aircraft's achievements validated Tupolev's skill and leadership, enabling him to play a central role in post-war Soviet aviation. Without the Tu-2, his later contributions, such as the Tu-4 strategic bomber and the Tu-95 intercontinental bomber, might not have been possible. Thus, the Tu-2 was not only a weapon of war, but also the vehicle of one man's political survival and professional resurrection. Culturally, the Tu-2 became a symbol of Soviet ingenuity under pressure. It demonstrated that even in the most repressive conditions, innovation could flourish when coupled with state urgency and industrial mobilization. Yet this legacy also underscores the paradox of the Stalinist system, where scientific talent was simultaneously repressed and exploited. The Tu-2 stands as one of the few major combat aircraft in history to have been designed in prison, a fact that continues to shape its place in historical narratives. The bomber's international legacy is equally important. Its export to China and Eastern Europe marked the beginning of the Soviet Union's role as a major supplier of advanced aircraft to Allied states. For many of these nations, the Tu-2 was the first true modern bomber in their arsenals, shaping tactics, training, and doctrine. Even though it was soon eclipsed by jet aircraft, its influence endured in the institutional memory of air forces across Asia and Eastern Europe. In museums today, the Tu-2 is remembered alongside other iconic Soviet aircraft of the Second World War, such as the Il-2 Sturmovik and the Yak-9. Preserved examples allow modern audiences to appreciate its streamlined fuselage, spacious bomb bay, and powerful radial engines. Its legacy is not defined solely by its numbers, around 2,500 units produced, but by the fact that it delivered consistent results in one of the most brutal air wars in history and remained relevant long after the war ended. The Tu-2's significance also lies in its place in the transition from piston to jet propulsion. As the last Soviet piston engine bomber to achieve wide deployment, it provided the Red Air Force with critical experience in handling fast, heavily armed, multi-role bombers. Lessons learned from its service informed the design and employment of jet-powered successors like the Il-28 and the Tu-16, ensuring that the Tu-2's impact extended well beyond its years of active duty. In the broader sweep of history, the Tu-2 embodies the dualities of war and politics, conceived in repression but remembered as a triumph. a machine of destruction that also became a vehicle for progress. Its story is not only about engineering and combat, but also about survival, adaptation, and the peculiar conditions under which innovation flourished in the Soviet Union. For these reasons, the Tu-2 remains one of the most significant bombers of the Second World War, an aircraft whose legacy extends far beyond its service life, influencing aviation, politics, and memory alike.